Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into some Stephen King today, specifically his book, Danse Macabre.
Oh, a classic.
And, we had a lot of requests to kind of dig into, well, how King sees horror.
Yeah.
Like, what makes it tick? Why are we so drawn to it? And is it really just about those jump scares?
Well, I think we can all agree it's a lot more than that, right? There's a psychology to it.
Definitely. And King, I mean, he really gets into that. Like, he connects horror to our deepest fears.
Our anxieties.
Exactly. And what's interesting is how he uses his own experiences, like growing up during the Cold War.
Oh, that had to have had an impact.
Huge impact, right? He talks
Yeah.
about those vivid memories of Sputnik and those duck and cover drills, the whole bomb shelter scene.
Constant threat of nuclear annihilation, yeah.
And it's like you can see how that shaped his view of the world. And it really comes through in how he analyzes horror films from that era.
The 50s, you mean?
Yeah, the 50s monster movies, all those alien invasions and creepy pod people.
Like Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Exactly. And King's point is that those weren't just cheap thrills. They were tapping into a very real societal anxiety.
What about the other?
Right. That fear of infiltration, of losing your individuality.
Like being taken over.
Yeah. And you can't ignore the Cold War context there. I mean, it's hard not to see those films as metaphors for communist infiltration.
For sure, but King actually goes deeper. He uses the term barometer to describe how horror reflects those anxieties of a given time.
Okay, so it's not just about specific events, but like a broader sense of unease.
Exactly. In the 50s, it was that fear of being overtaken, of losing your individuality. But fast forward to the 70s, and the landscape of fear kind of shifts.
The disco era. What were people freaking out about then?
Well, King argues that the horror of the 70s...
Grounded fear.
In a way, yeah. And he uses the Amityville horror to make this point.
Haunted house, right.
On the surface, yeah. But King sees something darker there, something lurking beneath.
What do you mean?
So you have this family struggling to afford their dream home, and then they're terrorized by unseen forces. But the truly terrifying thing is the subtext, that crushing weight of debt, the fear of financial ruin.
It's like the haunted house itself becomes a symbol of that broken dream.
Exactly. King actually calls the film a financial demolition derby. And it's not an isolated case either. He argues that this fear permeates a lot of 70s horror.
So is he saying there's always a direct connection between what's happening in the real world and the monsters we see on screen?
I think so. He argues that horror is like this symbolic pressure valve, a way to confront anxieties in a safe, fictional space.
I can see that. But it's not just societal fears, right? He also talks about the different ways we experience fear on a personal level.
That's right. And he breaks it down into 3 distinct categories.
Terror, horror, and revulsion, if I remember correctly. What's the difference?
So terror sits at the top of the fear pyramid, according to King. It's that slow burn dread, anticipation of something awful.
Like waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Exactly. Think of the unseen threat in the haunting. It's far more chilling than any visible monster.
Yeah, I get that. The anticipation is almost worse than the actual event.
Right. Then you have horror, which is more visceral, more immediate. You're confronted with a tangible monster, like in the thing.
Okay, so more in your face.
Exactly. It triggers that primal jump scare response.
Gotcha. And then there's revulsion, which is like, ew, gross. The lowest level, right?
He places it at the bottom of the hierarchy, but that doesn't mean it's not effective.
True. Sometimes those gross out scenes are the ones that stick with you.
Think of that chest burster scene in Alien. That pure revulsion.
Super effective, though, right? But where does King himself fall on this spectrum? What does he aim for in his own writing?
He admits that terror is the ultimate goal, but he isn't afraid to use horror or even revulsion if it serves the story.
So a master of all 3, basically.
Yeah, a blend of all 3 can make for a powerful horror experience. But it's not just about gut reactions either. King also talks about horror as a kind of modern fairy tale.
A fairy tale?
Yeah.
How so?
Well, he sees a link between those archetypes we find in fairy tales and the way they show up in horror movies.
So like the damsel in distress, the hero, the big bad wolf.
Think about it. The fear of the unknown woods, those are primal fears, right? Embedded in us from childhood.
So horror movies are playing on those same fears, but in a more adult context.
Yeah, and often using similar symbolic language. King uses Creature from the Black Lagoon as an example.
Interesting choice. Why that one?
Because the monster literally walls his victims in, and that speaks to that primal fear of being trapped or overwhelmed.
I've never thought of it that way, but it makes sense. So are you saying all the best horror movies work on a symbolic level?
I think King argues that the films that resonate most deeply go beyond those surface-level scares. They explore those deeper anxieties and universal fears.
Okay, so like, what's the example he uses?
He uses Stepford Wives.
The one with the robotic wives.
Yeah, and on the surface, it's this chilling story about those robotic wives replacing real women. But beneath that lies a commentary on gender roles, societal expectations.
That fear of losing your individuality,
Exactly.
which is terrifying when you think about it.
Oh, absolutely. And it's interesting that he draws a parallel to Rosemary's Baby, too.
Another classic.
Both films, in their own way, explore those anxieties of women losing control.
Especially within those patriarchal systems, right?
Right. And it's like, wow, those seemingly simple horror movies are actually tackling some pretty complex and unsettling themes.
Absolutely. It's that layering, that exploration of deeper meaning that elevates horror from mere entertainment to something far more thought-provoking.
Maybe even cathartic in a way.
Exactly.
And it's interesting how King connects this idea, anxieties about losing control, to another big theme in horror.
Oh, yeah.
That fear of the unknown.
Oh, for sure. And he ties that directly to our fascination with darkness.
Okay, both literal and metaphorical.
Exactly. He talks about how some of his favorite horror films, they really lean into that sense of darkness.
Like, what are some examples?
Night Must Fall, Night of the Lepus.
Just those titles. They already give me the creeps. Right. And he contrasts that with a film like The Man with the X-Ray Eyes.
Where the horror comes from seeing too much.
Yeah, it's like a cautionary tale about the dangers of knowledge,
So what we don't know is more terrifying than what we do know.
Sometimes, yeah. Think about that classic horror movie trope. The unseen monster behind the closed door.
Like in The Haunting.
Exactly. It's our imagination that fills in the blanks, and that's what creates the true horror.
So sometimes the scariest monster is the one we create in our own minds.
Exactly. And King argues that this applies to our reactions to real-life horror, too. He talks about how those childhood experiences with death, with things we can't quite comprehend.
Things that are just beyond our understanding.
Yeah, they shape how we view horror as adults.
It's like he talks about finding that dead cat as a child.
Oh, right. That scene in Danse Macabre.
Yeah, he was both fascinated and repulsed by it.
Yeah.
This mysterious, irreversible thing that had happened.
And he suggests that kind of fascination, that blend of wonder and revulsion, it stays with us.
And it comes out in how we react to horror.
Throughout our lives, yeah. It's like that morbid curiosity, but amplified by the intensity of childhood.
So horror becomes a way of revisiting those childhood fears.
But in a safe, controlled way.
Right, because it allows us to explore those dark corners of our minds, but without actually being in danger.
Exactly. And King also talks about that cathartic release horror provides.
Oh, yeah.
He describes it as this feeling of relief, almost of resurrection, that comes after watching a truly scary movie.
Like you've purged those fears, at least for a little while.
Right. It's like a roller coaster for the emotions.
You climb that hill of anticipation, plunge into the depths of fear, and then emerge feeling strangely cleansed.
Exactly. And that feeling isn't limited to films either. King talks about how certain horror novels achieve that same effect.
Any specific examples?
He mentions Ghost Story by Peter Straub.
Oh, I remember you mentioning that one earlier. You said it touches on that tension between order and chaos.
The Apollonian and Dionysian forces.
Right. And it's interesting how those forces are often gendered in horror, too.
Oh, yeah. How so?
Well, like in Ghost Story, it's a group of older men representing order and stability.
Okay.
And they're confronted with this supernatural force that threatens to disrupt their world.
And if I remember correctly, those supernatural forces are primarily female.
They are. And King suggests that this is a common trope in horror,
What do you mean?
This idea of female figures representing a chaotic, disruptive energy.
Threatening the established order.
Exactly. Which, of course, ties back into those societal anxieties about changing norms, the fear of the feminine.
It's definitely a recurring theme, and it's something King explores further in his discussion of Rosemary's Baby.
Oh, yeah, another classic.
Beyond the demonic elements, it also taps into that very specific fear of losing control, particularly in the context of pregnancy and motherhood.
That's a fear that must resonate with a lot of women.
Oh, for sure. But King argues that Rosemary's Baby also captures that broader sense of paranoia that was so prevalent in the late 60s.
It was a crazy time. The Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, all those traditional values being questioned.
Yeah, the old rules were being challenged. There was this sense that the world was becoming more unpredictable, more dangerous.
And Rosemary, she's like the perfect embodiment of that anxiety.
Yeah.
Right? trapped in a situation, not knowing who to trust.
And her own body being used against her will.
A total nightmare scenario.
King also points out the clever use of religious symbolism in the film.
Oh, right, that blurring of faith and doubt.
Yeah, the erosion of traditional religious beliefs and the rise of alternative spiritualities.
And the film suggests that those shifts can leave people vulnerable.
Open to manipulation by darker forces.
So it's not just about the literal devil.
Right, it's about that fear of losing your spiritual grounding in a world that's changing so rapidly.
And that sense of losing your grounding, well, brings us to another key theme. King explores
Paranoia.
paranoia, and he turns to what he considers the ultimate paranoia movie,
Which is,
Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
oh, classic.
The fear of being replaced, of losing your individuality to an unseen force.
Very relevant to the Cold War era, for sure.
And King points out that even though the director intended it as an anti-communist allegory, the film's paranoia resonates on a deeper level. It speaks to that universal fear of conformity, of losing your unique sense of self.
And that fear is just as relevant today, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we're constantly bombarded with messages about who to be, how to look, what to think.
And that's where King's insight is so valuable.
How so?
He reminds us that horror, at its best, is able to tap into those universal fears, those anxieties that transcend specific historical contexts.
So it's not just about the monsters, but about what those monsters represent.
The darkness that exists both within ourselves and within society as a whole.
Exactly. And that's what makes horror such a compelling genre. It allows us to explore those dark corners of the human psyche.
To confront those things that frighten us most.
But in a safe, cathartic way.
Precisely.
But it's not just about those external threats and societal anxieties, right?
No, definitely not.
King also talks about that horror that comes from within.
Right, the monster we carry inside ourselves.
Yeah, and he spends a lot of time in Danse Macabre exploring that concept.
The fascinating idea, isn't it, that the most terrifying monsters
Are often the ones we create ourselves.
Exactly.
And one of the books he uses to illustrate this point is Ray Bradbury's Something Wicked This Way Comes.
Oh, that's a great one.
And as we talked about earlier, it can be read as this kind of darker, more twisted version of Pinocchio.
Right. With that whole idea of temptation and those dark desires.
And the potential for those desires to consume us.
But there's also that element of childhood innocence in there, too.
Right, like it's serving as a counterforce to the darkness.
Yeah, and King points out how Bradbury uses archetypes and symbolism to explore those deeper themes.
Like the carnival itself becomes this really powerful metaphor for temptation.
The allure of the forbidden.
And the carousel, with its ability to age and de-age people, well, it plays on those anxieties we have about time and mortality.
And the desire to escape adulthood.
Yeah, it's like a reminder that those primal fears from childhood, they never really leave us.
They just morph and take on different forms as we get older.
And King argues that this is what makes horror so compelling.
How so?
It lets us tap into those deep-seated anxieties in a way that other genres just don't.
Right, it's like those fairy tales we hear as kids.
They imprint themselves on our subconscious,
And then horror comes along and reawakens those fears in a new way.
often in a pretty unsettling way.
Definitely. And King also discusses The Shrinking Man by Richard Matheson.
Another great example of that inner monster theme.
Yeah, and that one really tackles those themes of masculinity and identity.
The protagonist, Scott Carey, he's literally shrinking, right?
Right. Becoming less and less of a man.
In a world that values size and strength above all else.
Yeah, and as his body diminishes, all those anxieties and insecurities, they just get magnified.
He becomes so hyper-aware of his own flaws.
And King argues that this taps into that universal fear of being overwhelmed by forces we can't control.
Which is a pretty pervasive fear in today's world, too.
Absolutely. We're constantly bombarded with information, with demands, with expectations.
It's easy to feel like you're losing your grip.
And The Shrinking Man speaks to that anxiety in a very visceral way.
With Scott shrinking and becoming more and more isolated,
Trapped in this nightmare scenario.
where his worst fears are literally taking over his body.
Yeah, but King points out that even in that horror, there's a glimmer of hope.
Oh, how so?
Even as Scott shrinks, his intelligence, his capacity for adaptation,
They remain intact.
he finds ways to survive, to navigate this increasingly hostile world.
It's a powerful message about resilience.
The strength of the human spirit.
Even when you feel like you're shrinking, like you're losing everything, there's still that part of you that can endure.
That can adapt and find a way to persevere.
And that's one of the most compelling things about horror, isn't it?
Yeah.
It confronts us with our deepest fears.
but it also reminds us that we have the capacity to overcome them.
To find strength in the face of adversity.
It's a testament to the power of the human spirit.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Stephen King's Danse Macabre, what's the big takeaway for our listeners?
That's a good question.
Why should we care about all this talk of monsters and fairy tales and societal anxieties?
Well, because horror, at its best, it's more than just entertainment, right? It's a reflection of ourselves, of our deepest fears, anxieties, hopes.
And vulnerabilities.
Yeah, it's a way of exploring those parts of the human psyche that we often try to avoid.
It's like holding up a mirror to society and saying, this is what scares us.
This is what we need to confront.
And in doing so, horror can actually be cathartic.
Absolutely.
It allows us to process those fears,
In a safe environment.
like a roller coaster for the emotions.
Yeah, sometimes that's exactly what we need.
To feel alive, to feel connected to our own humanity.
For sure.
And if you're ready to take that ride, to delve deeper into the world of horror, I highly recommend checking out Danse Macabre,
It's a great read.
a fascinating journey into the heart of what makes horror tick.
Absolutely.
And as you venture into that world, think about what your own favorite horror films reveal about you.
About your deepest fears.
Is the monster under the bed, the masked killer, or something even more insidious, something lurking inside you?
That's a great question to consider.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of horror.
It was a pleasure.
Until next time, sleep tight.
And don't let the bedbugs bite.